All right. Does that really look like somebody's first attempt at bow ties? Well, it wasn't mine. It was my second. And I cheated. Well, let's not call it cheating. I prefer to call it shortcuts. I took a shortcut. So, in my mind, a shortcut is the fastest possible route you can get to a finished piece that you're really proud of. That said, more on bow ties and shortcuts later. This little slab is going to end up with 3 straight sides and 1 live edge. I'm going to try and use the miter saw, if it'll reach, to get this thing squared up, because that's definitely going to be the easiest route. Well, obviously that's not going to work. Now, since the miter saw doesn't have quite the reach we need to cut this piece, we're going to have to drag out the track saw. And by track saw, I mean the 2 pieces of MDF that I've glued together, used in conjunction with a couple of Harbor Freight clamps. And if you'll look in the background, you'll notice that my dog is a snob, or at least was a snob, because as soon as I mentioned Harbor Freight, she rolled over dead. When I mentioned shortcuts earlier, I should have said shortcuts and workarounds, also known as jigs. Now, jigs, they're lifesavers for people that can't afford or justify spending a lot of money on specialized tools that are probably just going to sit around and become expensive dust collectors, you know, dragged out occasionally and used. A lot of people just can't justify that, me included. Well, me included most of the time. More on that later. Now, one thing I will say about jigs, they're usually not as efficient or idiot-proof as a special tool is, but the average guy would rather pay a little more attention and take more time and effort with a jig than he would dropping his rent money on a track saw. As you can see, I've got quite a few jigs myself. But, and I'm talking a big Kardashian-sized but, if you do have the extra money, by all means buy the specialized tools. Like I said before, I'm all about shortcuts. In general, specialized tools are going to save you time, and they can also prevent some pretty serious mistakes. I remember one time I used a jig just like the track saw jig you're seeing in this video, and I cut 4 inches more than I meant to off of the end of a customer's $8,000 table. So believe me, if I could afford to drop the dough, my garage would be full of these high-end tools. Next, we're moving on to flattening this slab. Using my CNC, I'm taking a shortcut, but as you'll see, even expensive tools are not foolproof. I'm not sure if you can tell from this freeze frame or not because the router bit's out of focus, but this router bit is jammed up and the CNC can't push it through anymore, so it's just sitting there burning the slab is all it's doing. Of course, I noticed this immediately, and being the cool, calm, collected professional that I am, my first move is to promptly panic. Not my finest moment. Basically, what ended up being the problem here was just a dull bit, and fortunately, I had a replacement. Alright, so we finished flattening the slab for this thing, and our next step is going to be sanding. We'll use the drum sander for that. And I'm sure you guys have noticed something that I haven't mentioned adding to this thing before. If you look right here, you're going to see these little bow ties. Well, here's the deal. I tried to put some bow ties in. I've cut the bow ties out with my bandsaw. I've made a jig just like Cam from Blacktail Studios taught, showed how to do, and added the inserts, chiseled out the inserts for the bow ties themselves, and after it was all said and done, they really looked like hammered dog shit. So I took and put them on the CNC and cut them out there and let the machine do the work for me. Unfortunately for me, I was so mad at myself after I screwed the the inserts for the bow ties up so bad that I totally forgot to film the CNC process of cutting the slots for them and doing the bow ties themselves as well. But it all worked out in the end, and I think they turned out beautifully. Also, as you can see, I used a different colored wood. I believe I used ash. By the way, this drum sander is definitely a one-trick pony, but well worth the money. I wanted to note, at this point we really didn't have to run this thing through the drum sander, but I wanted to knock down the rough edges, or the rough ridges I should say, that were left by the CNC machine, because those could prevent our tape from sticking when we go through the epoxy process. And you'll see that in a little bit. Wow, these don't look too bad. Man, that CNC beats the hell out of my chisel skills. The little tiny cracks you see there, they're going to be filled with a mixture of glue and sawdust later, and they'll pretty much disappear. What my wife Susan is doing here, she's putting on a water-based polyurethane to seal the insides, the cracks where the epoxy is going to touch. And what that does is it actually forms a barrier to keep bubbles from coming out when we put the epoxy in. It doesn't work perfectly, but it sure cuts down on the bubbles later when we'll be doing the epoxy process. You'll see what we're talking about in a little bit. Susan's beginning the taping process here. We usually use Tyvek tape, and it needs to be against a pretty smooth surface so that it sticks really well, and that is, as I was saying before, that's the reason we ran this thing to the sander prematurely, basically, when we didn't really have to, because we wanted those smooth surfaces for this tape to stick when we put the epoxy in. So right now she's just getting it ready for the epoxy and trying to find every little spot, because that epoxy is, and it's a magician. It will find a way out if that's at all possible. Now it's epoxy time. Alright, the first thing I do, I don't buy, when I'm doing small amounts, I don't buy pre-measured cups. First of all, they're expensive. Secondly, they're inaccurate. So what I do is just get clear plastic cups. I'll pour in an ounce. If, say, I'm using 2 ounces, which is what I'm doing right here, I'll put in an ounce of water. I'll mark it with a Sharpie, and then I'll pour a 2nd ounce of water, mark that with a Sharpie. Then I'm going to dump it out, and I'm going to clean it, okay? Make sure it's good and dry. And then I'm going to pour my epoxy in. And the way I do that is I pour the thinner epoxy first, and then the thicker. It just works out better for measuring, believe me. Then I'm gonna mix the epoxy. Set a timer first for 4 minutes, and then start slowly mixing the epoxy. And the reason you do it slowly is to keep a lot of bubbles from forming. Now, this is tabletop that we're using today, and it's notoriously bad about that. Now, at this point, you're gonna really need to make sure you're scraping the sides down really well, because the thicker epoxy tends to stick to the sides, and if it does, you're not gonna get a good mix, and you're going to end up with rubber instead of epoxy, or hard epoxy at the end of all this. So anyway, best to make sure those sides are scraped down really well. Mix for 4 minutes, and then we're going to look down in there, and we're going to see at the end of that 4 minutes if we're getting a lot of little tendrils of epoxy. You know, you can tell there's 2 different kinds of epoxy in there, or 2 different thicknesses, I should say. And if you know that, if you see that, you know you're not completely mixed yet. So go ahead and pour into your 2nd cup, and then keep mixing until, well, set your timer for 3 minutes first, but then keep mixing and make sure that you see that the tendrils have gone away and it's perfectly crystal clear. At this point, you can add your pigment until you reach the color you like. Stir it until it's completely dissolved and your second timer has gone off. Then you're ready to pour. At this point, we're going to start using a heat gun to pop some of the bubbles that are coming up out of the epoxy that we poured, just so that they don't form and harden at the top. You can also use a torch, like a little propane torch, handheld one, but I would caution when you're using it around the Tyvek tape that it can burn the tape, because it's a lot hotter than a heat gun is on a lower setting. At this point, I do believe we've gotten all the little cracks and crevices filled with epoxy and stuff, so now we just have to sit back and let it cure. Alright, the epoxy's all nice and hard now. It's been a couple of days, and we're going to run it back through the big sander so that we can just basically knock the epoxy off, because that stuff is difficult to hand sand. It really is. That's one of the things that this drum sander is really handy for. Taking down ridges, like I mentioned before, and taking down epoxy. It's really a lifesaver for us. At this point, I'd like to say, if you like the video so far, I'd sure appreciate a thumbs up, and if you could click that subscribe button, it would be fantastic. Thanks. You know, even with a huge time saver like the drum sander, you still never get away from the monotonous hours and hours of brain-numbing hand sanding that you have to do in these pieces. And more sanding. By the way, did I mention sanding? You know, I'm making jokes about it here. However, even though it's the most mind-numbing task in the workshop, it's also probably the most vitally important. And if you don't do it right, like my beautiful wife Susan does, crappy sanding can turn what would have been a beautiful finished project into, that's okay. That's not what you want after all the time and effort you put into these things. Unfortunately, the amount of work and patience that goes into properly sanding a piece never gets the true amount of time and respect it deserves. But it also makes for extremely boring video, so I can't really show you the true amount of time and effort that goes into it without getting the algorithm's panties in a wad. So, on we go to the pretty stuff. Okay, now this of course is probably the most satisfying part of the build. We actually get to see what this piece is finally going to look like. My wife Susan is putting on Rubio Monocoat at this point. The process takes a little bit of time, but it's really a very easy application, and it will really bring out some beauty in the wood. Now Rubio makes for a much more stunning visual impact, a bigger wow moment on darker woods like walnut. However, you're going to see in the end, this wood right here turned out beautifully. At this point, I really need to mention this also. If you decide to put Rubio, or any sealant for that matter, on one side of a finished piece, you need to do it on the other side of the finished piece pretty quickly. You can't let it sit overnight, or in humid conditions, the untreated side will soak up water out of the air and swell, and it will literally bow your piece. Believe me, it's happened to me. Okay, so as we flip it back over, you're starting to see what the Rubio can kind of look like. I mean, it's starting to make it pop a little bit. However, there's a second coat we're going to add the second day. Even though they call it a monocoat, it will definitely take a second coat, and it does improve the luster and stuff. So This is it one more time in the bad light in the garage, and next you're going to see it out in the sunshine so that you can actually appreciate what it looks like after a second coat and in proper lighting. Also, as I'm sure the highly observant among us, or even the highly inebriated and semi-conscious ones among us have noted, this slab has grown legs. When I put the legs on, honestly I do it so often, I just did not figure that me drilling a few holes and bolting on some pre-manufactured legs I ordered off of Amazon would be very interesting, so I left that off. Could have been a mistake on my part. It's my very first video, so hopefully I will do better next time. And thanks so much for watching the video.